The afternoon my parents ambushed me and boxed up my entire career. My uncle dropped 4 sentences that had them sobbing on the carpet for my mercy. I was 22 when my parents deactivated my keycard, boxed up my desk at our family logistics startup, and had security walk me out. My older brother Caleb was the Ivy League golden child. I was the gritty workhorse who actually coded our software. Time for a corporate restructuring, my dad said, refusing to look at me. Caleb pressed a napkin into my palm before the elevator doors closed. Go to this address. If they find out I helped, they'll freeze my accounts. I stood on a rainy Chicago sidewalk at 3:15 p.m., holding a box of my life. I took an Uber to a Gold Coast penthouse. A stern man opened the door. Uncle Dominic. I didn't even know my dad had a brother. Dominic looked at my ID badge and sighed. I poured everything out. The stolen credit, the gaslighting, the fact they were transferring my equity to Caleb. They're presenting your software at the gala on Saturday, Dominic murmured, a dangerous smirk forming. They'll wish they never learned to code. Dominic invited my parents to a private Palmer House suite under the guise of an investor meeting. They strutted in wearing Armani, dad glowing, assuming they were securing Series B funding. Halfway through lunch, Dominic turned off the projector. Let's discuss your intellectual property, Dominic said. Dad laughed. Our IP is ironclad. Dominic slid a folder across the mahogany table. Your servers just went dark. Mom scoffed. A glitch. No glitch, Dominic said, checking his Rolex. I ordered the shutdown. I hold the original copyright to the algorithm. The licensing agreement you forged is void. You're bluffing, Dad said, face flushing. Dominic tapped his phone, putting our server host on speaker. We received a federal cease and desist, the host said. Your database is locked, Caleb gasped. Dad turned on Mom. Where is the original patent paperwork? Her hands trembled. We'll sort this out. No, Dad snapped. Did you use the Cayman accounts? The words hung like toxic smoke. Mom went pale. Caleb's head snapped up. Cayman accounts? The ones attached to my social security number? Dominic brought a massive spreadsheet on screen before anyone spoke. Mom started hyperventilating. Caleb gripped his hair. I sat perfectly still, realizing the magnitude of the bomb that just detonated. Dominic stared Dad down. Dad tried to stand, but Dominic pointed a single finger, and he collapsed back into his chair. The Ayers contacted my legal team on Tuesday, Dominic said, entirely devoid of emotion. Right after Caleb's signature was flagged on a $4.2 million offshore wire transfer. Dad aged 2 decades instantly. Dominic swiped to the next slide. Forged signatures, shell companies, a massive real estate scheme my parents ran, all pinned entirely on Caleb's identity. Dad lunged across the table. Coffee mugs shattered. Water flooded the polished wood. Caleb grabbed Dad's collar, screaming at him to explain. Mom's chair tipped over. Sit down, Dominic commanded, his voice booming off the walls, or I email this entire dossier to the SEC right now. Silence slammed into the room. Dad sat, shaking violently. Mom clutched her bag. Dad tried to spin it as a temporary tax shelter. Dominic let him talk for exactly 30 seconds before shutting it down cold. You committed massive wire fraud. You stole your own son's identity. You are 55. You engineered this. He tossed a flash drive onto the table. Audio recordings. You instructing your broker to forge Caleb's signature. Caleb stood up, kicking his chair aside, looking at Mom like a monster. I trusted you, he yelled. He pointed at me. You kicked her out because she wanted an independent audit. You threw her on the street to hide your felonies. The truth hit like a freight train. Dad flinched. Dominic delivered the ultimatum. They had exactly 48 hours to sign over 100% of the company to me and Caleb and take the drafted plea deal. If they fought it, Dominic would personally fund their prosecution. No negotiations. Mom fell to her knees, mascara bleeding, begging me to fix it. I looked down at her. You liquidated my future, I said coldly. Now I'm liquidating yours. Dominic opened the suite door, and my parents stumbled out like ghosts. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. A month later, with the company legally ours, Dominic called Caleb and me to his library. He slid a rusted lockbox across the desk. His stoic demeanor was gone. There is one more thing, he whispered. Something I found in their offshore files. The second I unlocked that box, I understood why he had orchestrated their downfall so perfectly. The hinges screamed a little as I pushed the lid back. The smell hit me first. Stale tobacco, dried adhesive, the distinct, suffocating scent of paper that has been locked in the dark for decades. It wasn't a corporate file. It was a life in ruins. I pulled out a stack of medical bills from the late 90s. The patient name printed at the top of each dot matrix sheet was Blythe. Pediatric oncology. Experimental marrow transplants. The totals at the bottom of the pages were staggering. Numbers that would have bankrupted any normal family. Clipped to the back of the final bill was a denial of coverage letter from an insurance provider. Beneath that was a handwritten letter from my dad. The ink was faded, but his sharp, aggressive handwriting was unmistakable. Dom, I am not liquidating my shares of Dad's trust for this. The doctors gave you the odds. I am not throwing good money after a lost cause. Do not ask me again. Do not show up at the house. Richard. At the very bottom of the box rested a death certificate. Blythe was 6 years old. I looked up. Dominic was standing by the window, staring out at the gray turn of Lake Michigan. His shoulders, usually so rigid and imposing, looked hollowed out. She was my daughter, he said to the glass. Your father and I inherited a substantial estate when your grandfather passed. It was tied up in a joint trust. I needed my half to fly Blythe to a specialist in Seattle. Richard refused to sign the disbursement. He stalled. He tied me up in probate court for 3 years, claiming I was emotionally compromised and unfit to manage the assets. Dominic finally turned to look at me. His eyes were entirely dead by the time the judge ruled in my favor and forced the liquidation. Blythe had been buried for 14 months. Richard used his half to buy his first commercial warehouse, the one that launched the company you just took from him. Caleb was was staring at the death certificate, his breathing shallow. You didn't just find out about the fraud, Caleb whispered. You've been watching them for years, decades. Dominic corrected softly. I paid for the private investigator who dug into their offshore accounts. And you, he pointed at me. The coding boot camps you attended in high school, the anonymous scholarship that covered your tuition, that was me. I needed someone inside their infrastructure who actually understood how to build the walls. I knew eventually they would cut corners. And I needed you to be the one holding the keys when they did. He wasn't a savior. He was a man who had spent 20 years meticulously sharpening a knife, and he had just used Caleb and me to drive it into my parents' ribs. We left the penthouse in absolute silence. Caleb drove us back to the company headquarters in the West Loop. The building was technically ours now. The paperwork had cleared. But as we walked through the glass doors, the atmosphere wasn't triumphant. It was a graveyard. Our first move was bringing in a forensic auditor to untangle the mess the feds hadn't frozen yet. Her name was Imogen Farrow, a woman in her late 40s who spoke in flat, terrifyingly precise sentences and drank green tea like it was whiskey. We set her up in my dad's old corner office. It took her exactly 3 days to ask us to sit down. The offshore accounts were just the vanity project, Imogen said, tapping a red pen against a thick binder on the mahogany desk. Your parents were running a much quieter, much dirtier operation locally. What kind of operation? I asked, a sick feeling blooming in my gut. Imogen opened the binder. Payroll withholding. They haven't been paying the matching 401k contributions for your warehouse staff for the last 18 months. They also haven't been passing along the health insurance premiums to the provider. They deducted the money from your employees' paychecks, and then they used it to float their operational costs. Caleb rubbed his face. How much? A little over $800,000, Imogen said, and the insurance provider sent a notice of cancellation 30 days ago. If one of your forklift drivers breaks a leg today, they aren't covered. We were the owners now. We were the sole officers of the LLC. We had inherited the legal liability for nearly $1 million in stolen employee wages. Can we liquidate any of the physical assets to cover it? Caleb asked, his voice cracking slightly. The Ivy League polish was peeling off him by the hour. Your parents heavily leveraged the truck fleet, Imogen replied. You owe more on the vehicles than they are worth. You need cash flow, and you need it yesterday, or the Department of Labor is going to pierce the corporate veil and come after both of you personally. I walked out of the office. I couldn't breathe in there. I took the elevator down to the lobby to get a coffee from the cafe next door. When the doors opened, I saw a man standing at the reception desk. He wasn't one of our corporate guys. He was wearing heavy work boots, faded jeans, and a canvas jacket that smelled like diesel exhaust and stale rain. He was arguing with the receptionist, his voice thick with exhaustion rather than anger. I walked over. Can I help you? The man turned. He looked to be in his 50s, with deep lines etched around his mouth. You're the daughter, the one who took over. Yes, I said cautiously. My name is Jasper Trask. I own Trask Logistics. We're a subcontractor for your regional runs. He pulled a thick manila envelope from his jacket and dropped it on the granite reception desk. It hit with a heavy thud. Those are 84 unpaid invoices, dating back 6 months. I stared at the envelope. Mr. Trask, we are currently auditing all accounts payable. I don't care about your audit, Jasper interrupted, keeping his voice painfully level. I have 14 drivers. I haven't been able to make payroll in 3 weeks. 2 of my guys are facing eviction. I've been floating the gas for the rigs on my personal credit cards, and they're maxed. Your mother sat in my office in June, looked me dead in the eye, and swore the transfer was held up by the bank. She lied. He stepped closer. He didn't raise a hand. He didn't have to. The sheer weight of his desperation was suffocating. I don't want an apology, Jasper said. I want my $200,000 by Friday, or I'm parking 14 semi-trucks across the entrances of your distribution centers, and I'm calling the local news. He turned and walked out into the rain. I went back upstairs. My hands were shaking. We were drowning. My algorithm, the beautiful, clean code I had spent years writing to optimize our supply routes, had merely made it faster and easier for my parents to steal from people like Jasper. The efficiency I built was a weapon used against blue-collar workers. I found Caleb on the small balcony off the break room. He was chain-smoking, something I hadn't seen him do since college finals. He had his phone pressed to his ear, his voice a frantic whisper. I can't do that. You know I can't do that. They monitor the accounts now, Caleb hissed into the phone. He paused, listening. I don't care where you are. You shouldn't have called me. He hung up and jumped when he saw me standing in the doorway. Who was that? I asked. Caleb dropped the cigarette and crushed it under his leather shoe. Nobody. An old friend from school. You lie worse than Dad, I said. Who was it, Caleb? He leaned back against the brick wall, looking up at the gray sky. It was Mom. Are you insane? I stepped onto the balcony, keeping my voice low. She tried to frame you for a federal felony. She sat in that hotel suite and watched Dad try to let you take the fall for the Cayman accounts. And you're taking her calls? She's sleeping in her car. Okay. Caleb shouted, his composure snapping. He grabbed his own hair, pulling it hard. Dad took whatever clean liquid cash they had stashed in a domestic safe, hired a high-powered defense attorney just for himself, and abandoned her. They froze all her cards. She has nothing. Good, I said. I meant it. She deserves worse. She wants to meet, Caleb said miserably. Just to talk. She's at a diner up in Skokie. I told her no. You were just on the phone telling her you couldn't move money for her. I corrected. You're getting played again, Caleb. She's desperate, and she knows you're the softest target. I'm not soft, he snapped. I just don't want my mother freezing to death in a Honda Civic. I'm going with you, I said. Caleb drove us in his Audi. The contrast between the luxury car and the grime of the Skokie strip mall was jarring. The diner was a neon-lit relic squeezed between a pawn shop and a vacant storefront. We found found her in a back booth. If I hadn't known her my whole life, I wouldn't have recognized her. The pristine blowout was gone, her hair pulled back in a greasy, uneven knot. She was wearing a cheap fleece zip-up that looked like she'd bought it at a pharmacy. No makeup, no jewelry. Her hands were wrapped tightly around a chipped mug of black coffee. Trembling, Caleb slid into the booth across from her. I sat next to him, keeping my arms crossed. Mom looked at me. There was no warmth in her eyes, just a hollow, feral exhaustion. "I need $5,000, Caleb," she said, her voice raspy. "No hello, no apologies, just cash. I have a friend in Arizona who will let me stay in her guest house, but I need gas money and enough to eat until the heat dies down." "I don't have $5,000 in cash," Caleb said, looking at his hands. "My personal accounts are still under review by the bank because of the wire fraud flags, and we can't pull from the business. It's bleeding out. You own a $50 million company." Mom spat, a flash of her old venom returning. "We own a $50 million corpse," I corrected coldly. "You and Dad hollowed it out. Imogen Farrow is going through the books. We know about the unpaid 401k matches. We know about Jasper Trask and the contractors you stiffed." Mom flinched slightly at Jasper's name, but she recovered quickly. She took a sip of her coffee and set the mug down. She looked at me for a long time, an ugly, bitter smile slowly forming on her cracked lips. "You think you're so smart," she whispered. "You think Dominic swooped in, played the avenging angel for his dead little girl, and handed you the keys to the kingdom to make it right. He gave us the equity," I said. "We saw the transfer paperwork." "Oh, he gave you the equity," Mom laughed, a dry, scraping sound. She reached into her cheap vinyl purse and pulled out a folded, heavily creased piece of paper. She slid it across the sticky Formica table toward me. "You coded the algorithm," she said, her eyes locking onto mine. "You built the engine, but the engine isn't what makes this company valuable. It's the data, the client lists, the proprietary routing histories, the shipping contracts." I unfolded the paper. It was a copy of a corporate bill of sale. It was dated 3 days before Dominic forced my parents into the Palmer House suite. "Dominic didn't just lock us out of the servers," Mom whispered, leaning across the table. "He copied the entire database. And then he sold exclusive, perpetual rights to all of our client data to our biggest competitor in Dallas for $12 million. The diner around me seemed to go entirely silent. I stared at the signature at the bottom of the page. It was Dominic's. "He gutted the company of its only real asset," Mom said, her voice dripping with toxic satisfaction. "He took the money. And then he handed the empty, debt-ridden shell to you and your brother. So when the ears and the Department of Labor finally come knocking, it's your names on the door." I stared at the black ink. The signature was bold, sweeping, and undeniably Dominic's. I read the date again. She was right. He had executed the sale 72 hours before he locked my parents in that Palmer House suite and forced them to sign the shell over to us. "Where did you get this?" Caleb asked, his voice entirely hollowed out. Mom took the paper back, folding it carefully and slipping it deep into her cheap purse. "Your father isn't the only one who knows how to hide things." When the servers went down, I drove to the data center. The tech there owed me a favor. He pulled a log of the last outbound packet transfers before the hard lock. Terabytes of data routed straight to Dallas. I tracked down the corporate filing myself. She wrapped her hands back around her coffee mug. "I have the certified copy from the county clerk. I have the IP logs. It's enough to prove Dominic transferred the assets in bad faith to intentionally defraud the new owners, you two." "Give it to us," Caleb said, reaching across the table. Mom pulled back, pressing herself against the cracked vinyl of the booth. $5,000. Caleb, cash. I give you the certified copies, the IP logs, and the tech's name. You take it to the feds. You prove Dominic dumped a fraudulent shell on you, and you save yourselves from prison." She looked at me. "And you get to keep your freedom. Both of you." She was trying to sell us our own salvation. Even completely broken, she was still trying to negotiate a deal. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my wallet, and laid a single $20 bill on the table to cover the coffees. "We're leaving," I said to Caleb. "What?" Mom's eyes widened. Panic finally cracked through the bitter facade. "You need this. The Department of Labor is going to crucify you. We'll find the logs ourselves," I said, standing up. "Enjoy Arizona. He won't let you," she yelled, ignoring the few other patrons in the diner who turned to look. Dominic covered his tracks. "I'm the only one who has the physical copies." Caleb didn't move. He was staring at the $20 bill on the table. Slowly, he reached into his jacket. He pulled out a gold money clip. He didn't have 5,000, but he had a thick stack of hundreds. Emergency cash he always kept on him. He slid it across the table. "Caleb, don't," I warned. He didn't look at me. "Give me the documents, Mom." She snatched the money so fast, she knocked over the creamer dispenser. She didn't bother to count it. She shoved it into her fleece pocket and pulled a thick manila envelope from the bottom of her purse. She threw it on the table, slid out of the booth, and walked out the door without another word. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't tell us to be careful. She just took the cash and vanished into the rain. Caleb picked up the envelope. We walked back to the Audi in silence. When we got back to the office, Imogen was still at Dad's old desk, a half-empty mug of green tea sitting on a stack of ledgers. I dropped the manila envelope right in front of her. "Tell me this is a forgery," I said. Imogen opened the envelope. She put on a pair of reading glasses and spent 10 minutes going through the certified filings, the IP logs, and the bill of sale. The silence in the room was suffocating. I paced the length of the office. Caleb sat on the leather sofa, staring blankly at the floor. Finally, Imogen took off her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. "It's not a forgery," she said flatly. "It's ironclad. Dominic held the original copyright to the algorithm. Because your parents voided their own licensing agreement through fraud, all intellectual property reverted back to him legally. The data generated by that algorithm, the client lists, the routes, the proprietary metrics, He claimed it all as derivative works. Can he do that? Caleb asked, looking up. He already did, Imogen replied. And he sold it to Sunward Logistics in Dallas for $12 million in clean cash. Then he gifted you a company that has no data, no clients, heavy debt, and pending federal investigations. He set us up to take the fall for the unpaid wages and the contractor debts, I said, my stomach twisting. He knew Jasper Trask was going to show up demanding $200,000. He knew the 401k matches were missing. It's worse than that, Imogen said. She pulled a fresh piece of paper from her own binder and slid it toward me. I found this in the mailroom a half hour ago. It was delivered by courier. I looked at the letterhead. Sunward Logistics, Legal Department. It was a cease and desist. Demand that you immediately halt all use of the proprietary routing software currently operating on your local servers, as it relies on historical datasets now exclusively owned by Sunward Logistics. Continued use constitutes corporate espionage and intellectual property theft. They're shutting off our algorithm, I whispered. The one I wrote. If you run a single truck tomorrow using that software, Sunward will sue you into oblivion, Imogen confirmed. You have no data. You have no routing system. You have 14 of Jasper Trask's trucks threatening to blockade your distribution centers by Friday, and you have no money to pay him. I sat down heavily in the chair opposite her. Dominic didn't just want to ruin my parents. He wanted to completely erase the legacy they built. He wanted the company dead, and he wanted Caleb and me to be the ones who buried it, taking all the shrapnel in the process. We were just pawns on his revenge board. We need a lawyer, Caleb said, his voice shaking. We need to sue Dominic. Bad faith transfer. Fraud. You have no money for a retainer, Imogen pointed out clinically. And Dominic has $12 million and a 20-year head start. He'll bury you in motions until the Department of Labor throws you in federal prison for the payroll theft. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. The caller ID was a Chicago area code, but a number I didn't recognize. Hello? I assume you've spoken with your auditor by now. Dominic's voice came through the speaker. It was perfectly calm. Unbothered. You set us up, I said, my grip tightening on the phone. I balanced a ledger. Dominic corrected. Your parents stole my daughter's life to build this company. I took the company's life to balance the scale. It's nothing personal. You made us legally responsible for nearly $1 million in stolen wages. I shouted. Imogen and Caleb both looked at me. Jasper Trask is going to lose his business because of you. Jasper Trask is going to lose his business because of your mother, Dominic said smoothly. I merely accelerated the inevitable. However, I am not entirely without mercy. I have a proposal for you. I put the phone on speaker and set it on the desk. What kind of proposal? You have 48 hours before Trask parks his trucks and goes to the press, Dominic said, his voice filling the quiet office. Sunward Logistics doesn't just want the data. They want the physical infrastructure, the warehouses, the truck fleet. They are willing to acquire the physical assets of your company for exactly $1.2 million. It's a terrible valuation, but it's exactly enough to pay off Jasper Trask, cover the stolen 401k funds, and satisfy the Department of Labor. We walk away with nothing, Caleb realized, leaning closer to the phone. You walk away without a federal indictment, Dominic countered, which is substantially more than your parents are going to get. Sunward's legal team, led by a man named Stellan Locke, is flying into O'Hare tomorrow morning. You will meet him at the warehouse in the South Loop at 9 a.m. You will sign over the physical assets, the debt will be cleared, and you will never speak to me again. The line went dead. I stared at the black screen of the phone. He had boxed us into a perfect corner. We had to sell the entire physical operation to the very company that stole our data, just to avoid prison. Do we do it? Caleb asked, looking at me. I looked at Imogen. Are there any other options? None that don't involve you both serving time, she said, taking a sip of her cold tea. He checkmated you. I thought about Jasper Trask standing in the lobby in his wet canvas jacket. I thought about the algorithm I had spent 3 years building from scratch, bleeding over lines of code late into the night, only to have it handed to a massive corporation in Dallas. Fine, I said, my voice hardening. We meet this Stellan Locke tomorrow, but I'm not signing anything until I see the wire transfers clear to Jasper Trask and the employee pension fund. We spent the night sleeping on the leather couches in the executive suite. There was no point in going home. At 8 a.m., Caleb and I drove out to the South Loop Distribution Center. It was a massive, concrete structure, echoing and cavernous. Forklifts beeped in the distance, loading the last few outgoing trucks before Sunward's cease and desist officially took effect. At exactly 9 a.m., a black town car pulled into the loading bay. A man stepped out. He was in his late 30s, wearing a tailored navy suit that looked completely out of place against the backdrop of pallets and diesel fumes. He carried a sleek leather briefcase. Stellan Locke, he said, extending a hand as he walked up to us. I didn't take it. Let's just see the paperwork. Stellan smiled thinly. He set his briefcase on a stack of wooden pallets and clicked it open. He pulled out a thick stack of contracts. Dominic said you were efficient. I appreciate that. The terms are simple. You transfer the deeds to the 3 regional distribution centers, the title to the 70 vehicle fleet, and the remaining office leases. In exchange, Sunward assumes the specific liabilities listed in Appendix B, namely the contractor debts and the payroll tax deficits. He handed me a silver pen. I took the pen, but I didn't look at the contract. I looked at the briefcase. Tucked into the side pocket of the leather interior, half hidden by a legal pad, was a blue folder. I recognized the logo on the corner of the folder. It wasn't Sunward Logistics. It was the crest of the private pediatric oncology clinic in Seattle, the one Blythe was supposed to go to. Where did you get that? I asked, pointing with the pen. Stellan followed my gaze. He frowned, quickly sliding the legal pad to cover the folder. That is confidential client correspondence. Your client is Sunward Logistics, Caleb said, stepping closer. Why do you have medical files from a Seattle clinic? Stellan closed the briefcase with a sharp snap. His polite demeanor vanished. Sign the the asset transfer, please. We are on a tight schedule. I looked at Caleb. Then I looked back at Stellan. Who actually owns Sunward Logistics? I demanded. Stellan stared at me. Sunward is a privately held corporation based in Texas. Who owns it? I stepped right into his space. Is Dominic on the board? I am not at liberty to discuss the corporate structure of my employer, Stellan said coldly. Sign the paper, or I get back in my car, and you can explain to the Department of Labor why you're $1 million short. He was bluffing. Or maybe he wasn't. But the panic in his eyes when I saw that blue folder told me everything I needed to know. Dominic didn't sell our data to a competitor. He sold it to himself. I stepped back from the briefcase, the pieces snapping together in my mind with terrifying speed. Sunward is a holding company, I said, my voice bouncing off the concrete walls of the loading bay. A shell. Dominic didn't sell our code to a competitor. He transferred it to a subsidiary he entirely controls. And now he's using that same company to buy our physical assets for pennies on the dollar. Stellan's jaw tightened. He didn't confirm or deny it. He just reached out and placed a manicured hand flat over the asset transfer contract. If you are refusing the terms of the acquisition, I will take my leave. Wait, Caleb said, his voice cracking. He grabbed my shoulder. Does it matter? If it pays off Jasper Trask and covers the pension funds, who cares if Dominic is the one buying the trucks? We get out clean. It matters, because he's hiding something, I said. I looked hard at the briefcase. You don't bring a 25-year-old medical file from a pediatric oncology clinic to a warehouse foreclosure, unless it's legally relevant to the transaction. Before Stellan could close the lid, I reached across the stack of wooden pallets and grabbed the blue folder. Stellan didn't try to physically wrestle it away from me. He wasn't a thug. He was a corporate lawyer in a $3,000 suit who didn't want to get diesel grease on his cuffs. But his face flushed a dull, angry red. That is private property, he snapped, his polite veneer completely gone. Hand it back, or I will call the police. This is my building, I said, stepping out of his reach. Call them. I flipped the folder open. Caleb hovered nervously at my side, his breathing shallow. Inside were 3 pieces of paper. The top one was a dot matrix bank ledger dated October 1999. The middle was a commercial property deed. The bottom was a signed affidavit from a notary named Vesper Quill. I looked at the ledger. It was a tracing of funds. $750,000 moved directly from my grandfather's estate trust into a commercial escrow account. Dad didn't just stall the payout, I whispered, the ambient cold of the warehouse suddenly seeping straight into my bones. He didn't just tie Dominic up in probate court. Caleb leaned in, tracing the account numbers with a shaking finger. He looked at the property deed beneath it, this escrow account. It was the down payment for this exact distribution center. And the other two, I said, scanning the document. Dad bought the foundation of this entire logistics company, using the cash that was supposed to fly Blythe to Seattle. Stellan snapped his empty briefcase shut. The sharp crack echoed in the bay. He smoothed his silk tie, recovering his composure with chilling speed. As I said, this is confidential client correspondence. But since you have breached privilege to read it, you understand the reality of the board you are playing on. Your father committed gross fiduciary fraud. These properties were purchased with stolen trust assets. They belong to Dominic. They have always belonged to Dominic. The $1.2 million Sunward is offering you today is a courtesy. A courtesy? I laughed, a harsh, scraping sound. He's trying to buy back his own stolen property. He is trying to clear the title, Stellan corrected, his voice dropping to a precise, icy register. If you refuse to sign the transfer, Sunward will simply file a civil suit claiming constructive trust over these physical assets. We will tie this LLC up in litigation for the next 10 years. In the meantime, you will default on Jasper Trask's invoices. The Department of Labor will audit your unpaid 401k matches, and you and your brother will go to federal prison for the payroll theft. Dominic can afford to wait you out. You do not have the time. He was right. It was a perfect, inescapable trap. If we fought him, we drowned in our parents' debts and went to jail. If we signed, Dominic got his revenge, his data, and the physical empire his brother had built on his daughter's grave. Caleb pulled a pen from his jacket pocket. His hand was trembling so badly, he almost dropped it. Where do I sign? Caleb, stop, I said. Stop what? He yelled, turning on me. The echo made the warehouse workers at the far end of the bay look up from their forklifts. Caleb lowered his voice to a frantic hiss. Trask is going to blockade the gates tomorrow. Mom is living in a Honda Civic. Dad is facing 20 years. We have no leverage. We sign the paper, we pay the workers, and we walk away with our lives. Dominic doesn't do courtesies, I said, staring at Stellan. He spent 20 years planning this. He doesn't leave loose ends. And he certainly doesn't hand out $1 million settlements just to save time on a title transfer. Stellan checked his watch. You have 5 minutes. He's afraid of discovery, I said, the realization hitting me. I looked at the notary affidavit at the bottom of the folder. Vesper Quill. If Dominic sues us in open court for constructive trust, he has to submit this ledger as evidence. He has to prove the 1999 trust fraud on the public record. Stellan's eyes narrowed a fraction of a millimeter. It was the only tell I needed. Dominic managed the estate before Dad locked it up, I said, thinking fast. If the ears opens a retroactive audit on my grandfather's trust because of a public civil suit, they aren't just going to look at Dad's embezzlement. They're going to look at everything Dominic did before 1999. You are grasping at straws, Stellan said flatly. Am I? I challenged. If Dominic's hands were clean, he would have dragged Dad into court the day he found this ledger. But he didn't. He engineered an elaborate, multi-year shadow operation to bankrupt us, steal the IP through a loophole, and now he's trying to buy the buildings back through a shell company in Texas. He's desperate to keep this out of the legal system. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I ignored it, keeping my eyes locked on Stellan. We aren't signing for 1.2. The physical assets are worth $6 million. You're going to pay pay us 3. Caleb stared at me like I had lost my mind. What are you doing? 3 million, I repeated. We pay off Trask, we fund the 401k, and Caleb and I walk away with enough capital to actually restart our lives. Otherwise, we let Trask park his trucks. We let the company implode. And when the bankruptcy courts start digging through the history of these deeds, Dominic's name is going to be dragged right into the federal spotlight alongside ours. Stellan stared at me. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant hum of the ventilation fans. I will have to call my client, Stellan said softly. He turned and walked away, pulling a phone from his tailored suit jacket, stepping out of the bay and into the Chicago rain. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. My knees felt weak. Are you insane? Caleb grabbed my arm. If he says no, we're going to prison. He's not going to say no, I said, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. Dominic is a ghost. He operates in the dark. He's not going to risk an ears audit over a few $1,000,000. My phone vibrated again. I pulled it out. It was Imogen Farrow. Imogen, we're at the warehouse, I said, answering it. I think we just found a way to squeeze Dominic for a real buyout. We might actually get out of this with some capital. There was a pause on the line. I could hear the faint clinking of her ceramic teacup. I need you to come back to the corporate office immediately, Imogen said. Her voice lacked its usual sharp, clipped efficiency. It sounded heavy. We can't leave yet, I said, watching Stellan pace in the rain through the open bay doors. We're in the middle of the negotiation. What's wrong? I spent the morning running a forensic trace on the missing payroll funds, Imogen said. The $800,000 in 401k matches that were deducted from the warehouse staff. Right. Mom and Dad diverted it to cover operational costs, I said. No, Imogen said quietly. They didn't. I frowned, glancing at Caleb. What do you mean? You said the money was gone. It is gone, Imogen replied, but it didn't go into the operating accounts. I pulled the routing numbers from the payroll processor this morning. The funds were diverted to a private domestic brokerage account. Okay, I said, the cold settling back into my stomach. Whose account? The account holder is listed as a domestic LLC, Imogen said, but the authorization signatures on the routing transfers aren't forged. They are digitally certified, multi-factor authenticated, and time-stamped from an IP address inside the building. I stopped breathing. Imogen, whose credentials authorized the transfer? Your brother's, she said. I slowly lowered the phone, turning to look at Caleb. He was standing a few feet away, watching Stellan through the rain, his arms crossed over his chest, shivering slightly in the damp air. Caleb, I said. He looked over at me. What? Did Dominic agree? Where did you get the cash you gave Mom at the diner yesterday? I asked. Caleb blinked, clearly caught off guard. What? I told you. I keep an emergency stash. What does that have to do with anything? You said your personal accounts were frozen by the bank because of the offshore flags, I said, taking a step toward him. If your accounts are frozen, how did you get $5,000 and hundreds out of an ATM? Caleb's throat swallowed dryly. He looked away, back toward the rain. I had it in a safe at my apartment. Leave it alone. Imogen just traced the missing 401k funds, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper so the warehouse workers couldn't hear. $800,000 stolen from the men and women driving those forklifts. Caleb didn't say anything. He didn't look at me. The color was draining from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale in the fluorescent light. The digital signature on the transfer was yours, Caleb, I said, and it wasn't forged. It was authenticated with your personal security token. He closed his eyes. Mom didn't set you up on the Cayman accounts, did she? I asked, the reality of the last 48 hours suddenly fracturing, reorganizing into a much uglier picture. Dad didn't steal your identity. Caleb rubbed his face with both hands, letting out a ragged, exhausted breath. When he finally looked at me, the panicked, victimized younger brother act was entirely gone. His eyes were cold, flat, and desperate. The Cayman accounts were Mom's idea, Caleb said quietly. But the local payroll? That was me. The company was drowning, and I had bad options trades I needed to cover on my personal margins. I thought I could borrow the pension money for a month, make the margin calls, and put it back before the quarterly audit. I stared at him, the golden child, the Ivy League graduate who had pressed a napkin into my hand and told me to go to Dominic for help. You stole the retirement funds, I said. I was going to put it back. Caleb hissed, taking a step toward me. But the market tanked, and then Dominic locked the servers, and I couldn't move the money back into the corporate ledger without triggering an internal alert. You let Mom and Dad take the blame for the federal wire fraud in that hotel room, I said, my voice shaking. You sat there and acted like they had betrayed you. They did betray me, Caleb said, his voice rising. They dragged me into the offshore scheme in the first place. I just took what I needed to survive when the ship started sinking. I looked down at the blue folder still in my hand. I had just leveraged Dominic for $3 million to save my brother from prison, to save a thief, through the open bay doors. Stellan Locke snapped his phone shut and began walking back out of the rain, his expression unreadable. He stopped at the edge of the concrete, shaking the rain from his umbrella before collapsing it. He didn't look angry anymore. He just looked like a man who had been given a new set of instructions. He walked over to the stack of pallets, clicked his briefcase open again, and pulled out a fresh pen. $3 million, Stellan said. Caleb let out a choked sound, something between a laugh and a sob. He leaned against the concrete wall, sliding down until he was sitting on a wooden crate. Thank God. Stellan didn't look at Caleb. He kept his eyes entirely on me. $3 million. But the structure of the buyout is non-negotiable. Sunward Logistics will wire $1.2 million directly to the LLC's operational account. That covers the invoices for Trask Logistics and the exact deficit of the missing pension funds. The remaining $1.8 million will be wired into a private account in your name alone. I stared at him. My name? Yes, Stellan said smoothly. Dominic is purchasing the assets, but he requires a sole guarantor for the transfer. The title will pass through you. Your brother's name name will be completely removed from the corporate registry, and he will receive zero financial compensation from the sale. You can't do that, Caleb snapped, standing up quickly. I'm a 50% shareholder. The transfer document we signed at the Palmer House gave it to both of us, and you breached your fiduciary duty to that LLC before the ink was even dry, Stellan said, his voice entirely devoid of warmth. Dominic knows you stole the 401k funds, Caleb. He didn't need your auditor to tell him. He has had packet sniffers on this network for 6 months. He watched you route the money to your margin accounts. Caleb froze. Dominic is willing to cover the deficit so the workers are made whole, Stellan continued, turning back to me. He has no interest in punishing forklift drivers, but he is not going to hand $1 million golden parachute to a thief. If you want the $3 million, you sign the transfer as the sole beneficiary, and you leave your brother with nothing. If you demand an even split, the offer reverts to 1.2, and the moment the audit is finalized, Dominic will personally hand the server logs of Caleb's theft to the SEC. Stellan placed the asset transfer contract on the pallet. Next to it, he placed a secondary document, a divestment agreement. Sign them both, Stellan said, or we walk. Caleb grabbed my arm. His grip was tight, his nails digging into my jacket. You can't do this. I'm your brother. I looked at his hand on my arm. Then I looked at his face. The panic was real, but it wasn't the panic of someone who regretted what they had done. It was the panic of a cornered animal realizing the trap had finally snapped shut. You stole their retirement, Caleb, I said, my voice eerily calm. Jasper Trask is maxing out his credit cards to buy diesel. Mom is sleeping in a car. And you stole $800,000 to cover bad options trades. I was going to put it back, he yelled, shaking me slightly. I was trying to save myself. Mom and Dad were going to let me take the fall for the Cayman wire fraud. I needed capital to run, to get my own lawyers. What was I supposed to do? You were supposed to be better than them, I said. I pulled my arm out of his grip. I picked up the silver pen from the pallet. Don't, Caleb whispered. Please, I have nothing. My accounts are frozen. If you take this, I'm completely wiped out. I signed the asset transfer. Then I pulled the divestment agreement toward me and signed that too. I pushed the papers across the rough wood toward Stellan. He checked the signatures, nodded once, and slipped them into his briefcase. The funds will be wired within the hour, Stellan said. The 1.2 will hit the corporate account. I strongly suggest you pay Mr. Trask before noon. He closed the briefcase, turned, and walked back to the Blacktown car. The doors shut heavily, and the car pulled away, disappearing into the gray morning rain. Caleb was staring at me. He looked completely hollowed out. I'll give you $10,000 from the personal wire, I said, not looking at him. Enough for a deposit on an apartment and a few months of groceries. After that, we're done. Don't call me. Don't come to the office. Don't ask me for anything else. He didn't argue. He didn't yell. The fight had completely drained out of him, replaced by the crushing realization that he had played the same game our parents had, and he had lost just as badly. He turned and walked out of the loading bay, heading toward his Audi. I didn't watch him drive away. I took an Uber back to the West Loop office. The ride felt like it took hours. The city passed by in a blur of wet asphalt and brake lights. The entire empire my parents had built, the warehouses, the trucks, the contracts, the offshore accounts, was gone, erased in less than a week. When I walked into the executive suite, Imogen was still at the desk. She had a new pot of green tea steeping. The wire hit, she said, looking up from her laptop. $1.2 million in the corporate operating account. I've already initiated the transfer to the pension provider to restore the 401k funds. The liability is cleared. And Trask? I asked, dropping my wet jacket on the leather sofa. Imogen tapped a key on her keyboard. I just drafted the cashier's check for the 84 unpaid invoices. $212,000, including late penalties. It's ready to print. Print it, I said. 10 minutes later, I was standing in the lobby downstairs. I had called Jasper Trask from the elevator. He walked through the glass doors a few minutes later, still wearing the same canvas jacket, shaking the rain off his shoulders. He looked exhausted, the kind of bone-deep tired that comes from weeks of not knowing how you're going to feed your family. I walked over to the reception desk and handed him the envelope. He opened it. He pulled out the cashier's check. He stared at the number for a long time. His thumb traced the embossed edge of the paper. This clears the backlog, Jasper said quietly. He looked up at me. His eyes were red-rimmed. But Sunward just issued a notice to all subcontractors. They bought your routing data. They bought your warehouses. Are they keeping our contracts? I don't know, I answered honestly. But Dominic operates entirely on efficiency. Your fleet knows the regional routes better than anyone. He'd be stupid to replace you. Jasper folded the check and put it carefully into the breast pocket of his jacket. He zipped it up. Your parents almost ruined a lot of good people. I don't know what happened between yesterday and today to make this check print, but I know it wasn't them. He extended a rough, calloused hand. Thank you. I shook it. I'm sorry it got to this point, Mr. Trask. He nodded, turned, and walked out into the rain. His shoulders looked a little lighter. I went back upstairs. The corporate office felt different now. It was huge, full of expensive mahogany furniture and frosted glass partitions, and it was entirely empty. The staff had been sent home. The phones weren't ringing. It was a ghost ship. Imogen was packing her binders into a leather satchel. Are you leaving? I asked. My audit is complete, she said, snapping the satchel shut. The liabilities are zeroed out. The physical assets belong to Sunward. The LLC is effectively a defunct shell. You'll need a standard bankruptcy attorney to formally dissolve it with the state, but there's no money left to audit. She pulled on her trench coat. She looked at me, her expression as flat and analytical as ever. I saw the secondary wire. The $1.8 million to your personal account. Dominic's condition, I said defensively, though I didn't know why I felt the need to explain myself to her. He wouldn't clear Caleb. I know, Imogen said. I read the IP logs. Your brother is lucky Dominic decided to buy the assets instead of sending the packet traces straight to the FBI. She slung the satchel over her shoulder. You have capital now. You have your clean code. Start over. Don't build what they built. She walked to the elevator, pressed the button, and the doors slid closed. I was completely alone in the building. I walked into my dad's old office and sat in the massive leather chair behind the desk. I opened my laptop. I pulled up my bank account. The balance was staring back at me in stark black numbers. $1,804,212. I had won. I had survived the ambush. I had outmaneuvered Dominic, saved the workers, cut out my toxic family, and walked away with enough money to fund my own startup, entirely on my own terms. It was a clean slate. Then, my phone buzzed. It was a text message from Caleb. Check the news. I frowned, my heart skipping a beat. I opened a new tab on my browser and went to the local Chicago news aggregator. The top headline was breaking, less than 20 minutes old. Federal raids at Sunward Logistics Dallas headquarters. I clicked the article, my hands suddenly going cold. The text was sparse, updated only minutes ago. The FBI and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division had simultaneously raided the corporate offices of Sunward Logistics in Texas, alongside 3 regional distribution centers in the Midwest. Warrants were executed regarding a massive, multi-year money laundering and offshore tax evasion syndicate. I stared at the screen. The distribution centers in the Midwest, the ones I had just signed over to Sunward an hour ago. My phone buzzed again. An incoming call. An unknown Dallas number. I answered it. Hello? You set me up. Dominic's voice came through the speaker. The cold, unbothered control was entirely gone. He sounded breathless. He sounded panicked. The data transfer. The asset acquisition. You tipped them off. I didn't tip anyone off, I said, standing up, my mind racing. Dominic, what is going on? The SEC agents were waiting in the lobby when Stellan walked in with the signed asset transfer. Dominic snarled. They didn't just freeze Sunward's accounts. They froze everything. My personal trusts. The operating capital. They have the Cayman routing numbers. The Cayman routing numbers? I echoed, the pieces colliding in my head. My parents' Cayman accounts? They weren't your parents' accounts. Dominic yelled, the facade finally breaking completely. Where do you think your father got the connections to set up offshore shell companies? He was a warehouse manager. I built the shelters. I ran the money through Sunward. Your parents just used my architecture to hide their embezzlement. I stopped breathing. The quiet, terrifying reality of the last 20 years suddenly inverted. Dominic wasn't a grieving father who had spent 2 decades meticulously watching from the shadows, waiting for his brother to slip up. He was the architect. You ran the Cayman accounts, I whispered. That's how you knew about the $4.2 million wire transfer Caleb's signature was flagged on. You didn't find out from a private investigator. You found out because it was your network. I warned Richard, Dominic said, his voice dropping to a frantic, vicious hiss. I told him the ears was auditing Sunward's subsidiaries. I told him to stop moving the money, but he got greedy. He tried to dump the local logistics cash into the offshore shells before the feds could look at his domestic books. He triggered the federal flag on my entire network, the Palmer House suite, the theatrical presentation of the server lock, the righteous anger over Blythe's medical bills. It was all a screen. He didn't lock the servers to punish my parents. He locked the servers to stop my dad from moving any more money and exposing Sunward. And he forced us to sign the company over to him so he could scrub the local servers clean before the FBI knocked on our door. You used us, I said, gripping the edge of the mahogany desk. You bought the physical assets this morning because the feds were closing in on Sunward, and you needed clean domestic real estate to collateralize your frozen accounts. I am going to destroy you, Dominic promised, the line crackling with static. You think you're safe because you walked away with the cash? I know about Caleb's 401k theft. I have the IP logs. I will hand them to the federal prosecutor tomorrow morning. I didn't steal the 401k, I said evenly. Caleb did. Do you think the SEC cares? Dominic laughed bitterly. You were the sole corporate officer who signed the asset transfer to a known money laundering front. You took a $1.8 million personal payout from a frozen account. You're an accomplice. The line went dead. I lowered the phone. I looked at my laptop screen. The $1,804,212 was still sitting in my account. But it wasn't clean capital. It was Sunward money. It was Dominic's money. And if the feds had frozen Sunward's assets 20 minutes ago, it meant the transfer had gone through right before the hard lock. I was holding nearly $2 million of federal evidence. I grabbed my laptop and shoved it into my backpack. I grabbed my jacket. I had to get out of the building. If the FBI was raiding the regional distribution centers, it was only a matter of time before they realized the corporate headquarters in the West Loop was part of the same network. I sprinted to the elevator and hit the lobby button. The doors closed, and the carriage began to drop. My phone rang again. It was Caleb. I almost didn't answer it, but the panic in Dominic's voice was still echoing in my ears. I hit accept. Did you see it? Caleb asked, his voice tight, background noise roaring behind him. It sounded like traffic. I saw it, I said, watching the floor numbers tick down. Dominic just called me. He ran the Cayman accounts. Caleb, he was the one laundering the money. Dad was just using his network. When Dad triggered the ears flag, Dominic panicked and orchestrated this whole hostile takeover to bury the evidence. I know, Caleb said. I froze. What do you mean you know? I told you, Caleb said, his voice eerily calm despite the noise behind him. I'm not soft, and I wasn't going to let Dominic wipe me out. Caleb, what did you do? When I went to the diner yesterday to give Mom that cash, Caleb said, she didn't just give me the bill of sale for the algorithm. She gave me the raw IP logs her tech hold from the data center, the outbound packet transfers. The elevator dinged, the doors slid open to the empty lobby. I stepped out, gripping the phone tight. Imogen reviewed those logs. They just proved Dominic transferred the data to Dallas. Imogen reviewed viewed the logs Mom printed, Caleb corrected. But Mom gave me the original flash drive. I went through the raw data last night. Dominic didn't just transfer our proprietary routing data. The server pipeline was wide open. I saw the metadata for Sunward's entire offshore financial registry. Everything he was hiding in Dallas was mirrored through our servers before he locked them down. I stopped walking. The glass doors of the lobby were 10 feet away. The Chicago rain was coming down in sheets. You had Sunward's financial ledgers? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. And you didn't tell me? You were busy playing the moral superior, Caleb said bitterly. You were busy deciding I belonged in the gutter with Mom and Dad. So this morning, after you signed away my equity, after you left me with absolutely nothing and kicked me out of the warehouse, I made a phone call. Who did you call, Caleb? The Ayers Criminal Investigation tip line, Caleb said. I gave them Stellan Locke's name. I gave them Sunward's corporate registry, and I emailed them the entire encrypted flash drive. My stomach hit the floor. Caleb, Dominic transferred $1.8 million of Sunward's cash to my personal account an hour ago. You just tipped the feds off to the account the money came from. I know, Caleb said. They're going to see the transfer. They're going to think I'm part of the laundering network. You should have demanded the even split, Caleb said softly. I told you we were family. I told you I needed you. Caleb, I'm at O'Hare, he interrupted. I used the 10 grand you wired me to buy a ticket to Dubai. They don't have an extradition treaty for financial crimes. Enjoy the 1.8 million. Assuming the SEC doesn't seize it before you can buy a coffee. He hung up. I stood in the empty lobby, listening to the dead air on the line. Outside, the rain was washing the streets clean, drumming against the heavy glass doors. I looked at my reflection in the glass. I looked like my mother, pale, tired, cornered, but I wasn't her, and I wasn't Caleb. They ran. They hid money in the Caymans. They bought one-way tickets to the Emirates. They tried to buy their way out of the collapsing house they built. I walked over to the granite reception desk and opened my laptop. I pulled up my bank portal. The $1.8 million was still there. Clean black numbers on a white screen. In 5 minutes, maybe an hour, the feds would trace the outbound wire from Sunward, and my accounts would be frozen. If I tried to move it, I was laundering. If I left it, I was a beneficiary of a criminal enterprise. I pulled my phone back out and dialed the only person who had spoken a true sentence to me in the last 72 hours. Imogen answered on the second ring. You should be celebrating. Or hiding. I'm neither, I said, my voice steadying. Dominic is Sunward. He ran the offshore shells my parents used. The FBI just raided his Dallas headquarters because Caleb dumped the encrypted server logs to the Ears tip line before he fled the country. There was a long silence on the line. I could hear the rhythmic thrum of her windshield wipers. And you have $1.8 million of Sunward cash sitting in your personal account, Imogen stated flatly. Yes, do you want to run? She asked. No, I said. I want to burn him to the ground. All of them. But I need a federal lawyer, and I need to know how to surrender this money before the SEC freezes it. I'm turning the car around, Imogen said. I know a former OSA in the loop who handles corporate whistleblowers. Do exactly what I tell you. Take a screenshot of the bank ledger showing the origin of the wire. Print the emails from Stellan Locke. Print the divestment agreement that forced Caleb off the LLC. Put everything in a physical folder, close your laptop, and stand outside. Do not log back into that bank account. I did exactly as she said. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in the passenger seat of Imogen's Volvo, heading toward the Dirksen Federal Building. The next 48 hours were a blur of sterile conference rooms, bad coffee, and men in cheap suits asking the same questions from 6 different angles. I handed over the laptop. I handed over the bank access. I gave them Stellan Locke's name, the timeline of the buyout, and the exact terms Dominic had extorted me with to sign over the physical assets. Because Caleb had dumped the raw IP logs anonymously, the Department of Justice had a massive puzzle but no context for the final, frantic moves Dominic made in Chicago. I gave them the context. I gave them the motive. I handed them the 25-year-old trust fraud ledger I had swiped from Stellan's briefcase, proving Dominic's entire financial empire was built on stolen family money. I was the state's dream witness. I didn't ask for immunity. I demanded it in exchange for the missing pieces. My lawyer negotiated a complete exemption from the wire fraud and corporate espionage charges. The $1.8 million was seized as federal evidence. I walked out of the federal building 2 days later with $34 in my checking account and a clean name. The fallout was seismic. Dominic was arrested in his Gold Coast penthouse before the weekend. The FBI didn't even let him put on a tie. They walked him out in a pair of sweatpants. His 20-year revenge plot crumbling not because his brother outsmarted him, but because he underestimated the niece he used as a pawn. He had meticulously orchestrated every move on the board, but he couldn't control Caleb's cowardice or my refusal to play the game. He was denied bail. My parents didn't fare much better. Dad was indicted for the initial local fraud, tax evasion, and embezzlement. Without the Cayman money or the company assets to pay his high-powered defense attorney, he was assigned a public defender who immediately advised him to take a plea deal for 8 to 12 years. Mom never made it to Arizona. She was picked up by state police at a motel in Missouri on a federal warrant. They seized the $5,000 in cash she had extorted from Caleb. She's currently awaiting trial in a federal holding facility in Chicago. As for Caleb, he made it to Dubai. But without access to his domestic accounts, his trusts, or the offshore shells Dominic controlled, his emergency cash is finite. He can never return to the United States without facing an immediate federal indictment for the theft of the 401k funds and his complicity in the wire fraud. He is a man without a country, living out his days in a desert, waiting for his bank balance to slowly tick down to zero. It's been 6 months since the company collapsed. I didn't try to salvage the logistics firm. The state dissolved the LLC, and the physical assets were auctioned off by the bankruptcy courts to pay restitution to the remaining creditors. Jasper Trask got to keep his trucks. The warehouse workers kept their pensions. I'm sitting at a small, second-hand desk in a co-working space in the West Loop. It smells like cheap roasted coffee and ozone from the laser printer in the corner. My laptop screen is filled with lines of fresh, clean code. I lost the original algorithm. Sunward's assets were seized, and the IP is locked in a federal evidence vault for the next decade. But they only seized the code. They couldn't seize the mind that built it. I'm writing a new one. It's faster. It's leaner. It doesn't rely on stolen proprietary data. And it isn't designed to squeeze pennies out of blue-collar contractors. It's designed to optimize independent fleet routes, giving guys like Jasper Trask the same logistical advantage as the massive corporate carriers. The door to the office clicks open. Jasper walks in, wearing the same faded canvas jacket. He drops a paper cup of coffee on my desk and looks at the scrolling text on my monitor. "How's it looking today?" he asks, his voice gravelly but light. "Almost there," I say, taking a sip of the coffee. "We start beta testing your regional routes next Tuesday." He nods, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face. He taps the edge of my desk twice, turns, and heads back out to his trucks. I turn back to my screen. My parents liquidated my past. Dominic tried to liquidate my future. But as I type the next line of code, watching the engine come to life piece by piece, I realize they both failed. I'm exactly where I belong, building the foundation, brick by brick. And this time, nobody else holds the keys.